Hello and happy Wednesday, guys. It's been a while, but we are going to continue reading our book, Liddy. We're going to continue with chapter 20 today. So, our goal for today, Wednesday, May 6th, is to read chapter 20. And we want to answer chapter 20 questions on EDSB. Okay, there's going to be 10 questions that you have to read and answer after I read chapter 20 with you. So our learning target is going to be, I can answer text-dependent questions from chapter 20. Okay, so let me go ahead and open up the book for you. Let's do a new share. I'm going to open up the book right here. And we're going to read chapter 20B is for Bridget. Okay, so make sure you're following along with me as I read chapter 20 because you're going to have to answer 10 questions about this chapter after we read. Okay, so B is for Bridget. Remember, Bridget is the new girl. She is the Irish girl. She is very slow at her job. She does not know what she is doing at first, kind of like Liddy, but a little bit worse. So B is for Bridget. Remember, Diana is gone. She got pregnant, and so she needed to leave the factory. So Rachel is gone, Diana is gone, Charlie is gone. It is just Liddy working at the factory with Bridget and the other girls. Okay, B is for Bridget. Bridget had 2 looms now and would soon be ready for a third. She stood between them proudly, the sweat pouring from her forehead in concentration. If she would wear less clothing, but no, the girls from the acre wore the same layers of dress summer and winter. Still, despite her craziness, Bridget was turning into a proper operative. Mr. Marsden hardly came past Liddy's looms these days. When their eyes met by chance, it was as though they had never been introduced. Earlier, his coldness had worried her. She feared then that he might find some reason to dismiss her, so she had been scrupulous to observe every regulation to the letter. As the days went on, she became less anxious about Mr. Marsden's state of mind, much preferring his coolness to the rosebud smiles and little pats she had endured before her illness. She treated herself to some more books. In honor of Ezekiel Freeman, what a handsome name her friend had chosen for himself, she bought Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave written by himself, and a Bible. Both volumes became a quiet comfort to her Sunday loneliness, because as she read them, she could hear Ezekiel's rich, warm voice filling the darkness of the cabin. She had liked Mr. Dickens' account of his travels in America, but all but the Lowell part. It was, as Diana had warned her, romantical. There was no mention in its rosy descriptions of sick lungs or blacklisting or men with wives at Concord. July wore on its weary way into August. It seemed a century since the summer just a year ago when she had read and reread Oliver Twist and dreamed of home. She had been such a child then, such a foolish, unknowing child. As always, many of the New England operatives had gone home. Bridget took on her third loom. More Irish girls came on as spare hands. Some of the machines simply stood idle. The room was quieter. Liddy took to copying out passages from Mr. Douglass and the Bible to paste on her looms. She liked the Psalms best. I will lift mine eyes unto the hills, and by the rivers of Babylon there we sat down. Yeah, we wept when we remembered Zion. The Psalms were poetry. No, songs that rode the powerful rhythm of the looms. Sometimes she composed her own. By the rivers of Merrimack and Concord, there we sat down. Yeah, we wept when we remembered. I must forget, she thought. I must forget them all. I cannot bear the remembering. Liddy was strong again. Her body no longer betrayed her into exhaustion by the end of the day, and she was past shedding tears for what might have been. It was a relief, she told herself, not to carry the burden of debt or, what was worse, the welfare of other persons. A great yoke had been lifted from her shoulders, had it not? And someday the stone would be taken from her breast as well. Between them, she and Bridget coached several of the new spare hands, all of them wearing far too much clothing in this suffocating heat. But me mother says me capes will keep me cool, one of the girls insisted. Liddy let it be. She hadn't managed to persuade Bridget to take off her silly capes. How could she expect to persuade the new girls? Still, she was more patient with him than she had ever been with poor Bridget at the beginning. She had to be. Bridget herself was a paragon of gentleness, teaching the new girls all that Lydia and Diana had taught her, never raising her voice in irritation or complaint. Lydia watched her snip off a length of thread from a bobbin and lead one of the clumsier girls over to the window and show her in the best light how to tie a weaver's knot. It was exactly what Lydia remembered doing, but she knew to her shame that her own face had betrayed exasperation, while Bridget's was as gentle as that of an ewe nuzzling her lamb. She smiled ruefully at Bridget as the girl returned to her own looms. Bridget smiled back broadly. She's a bit slow, that one. We're all allowed to be fools the first week or two, she said, hearing Diana's voice in her head. There had been a short note from Diana telling her not to worry, that she had found a place in a seamstress's shop. But how could she not be anxious for her? Bridget was continuing sadly, but I'm a fool yet. She nodded at the psalm pasted on Liddy's loom. And you, such a scholar. Liddy slid her fingers under the paper to loosen the paste and handed it to Bridget. Here, she said, for practice. I'll make another for myself. Bridget shook her head. It will do me no good. I might as well be blind, you know. But I sent you a note once. I took it straight away to Diana to read to me. You've learned your letters, at least. Shamefaced, the girl shook her head. Liddy sighed. She couldn't take Bridget on to teach, but how could she begrudge her a chance to start? She made papers for the girl to post. A is for agent. Beside it was a crude picture of a man in a beaver hat, the stern high priest of those invisible Boston gods who had created the corporations and to whom all in Lowell daily sacrificed their lives. B is for Bobbin and Bridget, too. B was instantly mastered. C is for carding. D is for drawing in. She went on, using as far as possible words Bridget knew from factory life. Each day, Liddy gave her 3 new papers to post and learn, and at the end of the day, to take home and practice. So it was that day by day, without intending to be, Liddy found herself bound letter by letter, word by word, sentence by sentence, page by page, until it was, come by when you've had your supper, and we'll work on the reader together. Or on a Sunday afternoon, meet me by the river, and I'll bring paper and pens for practice. She did not go to Bridget's house. She was not afraid to go into the acre. She was not frightened by the rumors of robberies and assaults, but somehow she was reluctant to go for Bridget's sake. She did not want Bridget to have to be ashamed of the only home she had. At last, a letter came from Charlie. She had not allowed herself to look for one, but when it came, she realized how she had longed to hear, just to be reminded that she had not been altogether forgotten. Dear Sister Liddy, Charlie did make his letters well. We are fine. We hope you are well too. Rachel began school last month. Her cough is nearly gone, and she is growing quite fat with Mrs. Finney's cooking. Luke Stevens says he has had no reply. Do you think kindly on him, Liddy? You need someone to watch out for you as well. Your loving brother, Charles Worthen. She almost tore this letter up, but stopped at the first hair. She had nearly ripped the page across Charlie's name. September came. Some of the New England girls had returned to the weaving room, though the room now was mostly Irish. No Diana, of course, though there was something in Liddy that kept waiting for her, that kept expecting to see the tall, quiet form moving toward her through the lint-filled room. She had taken something from the weaving floor with her going. There was no quiet center left in the tumult. A letter arrived in September on thick, expensive paper, the address decked out in curlicues. We regret to inform you of the death of Maggie M. Worthen. They hadn't even gotten her name right. Poor Mama. Nothing ever right for her in life or death. Liddy squeezed her eyes closed and tried to picture her mother's face. She could see the thin, restless form rocking back and forth before the fire, the hair already streaked with gray. But the face was blurred. She had been gone so long from them, gone long before she died. Fall came, not the raucous patchwork of the Green Mountains, but the sedate brocade of a Massachusetts city. The days began to shorten. Liddy went to work in darkness and came back to supper in darkness. The whale oil lamps stayed on nearly the whole day in the factory, so water buckets were kept filled on every floor. Fire was a constant dread while the lamps burned. As the days grew short, breakfast came before the working day began. There was, as always, barely time to swallow the meals, though the food was not as ample as it had been a year ago. At the end of the day now, she waited for Bridget, and they would go out together. Often all the other girls passed them on the stairs or in the yard, for they would be talking about what Bridget had read since the day before, and Liddy would solve the mystery of an impossible word or the conundrum of a sentence. Then one evening she realized that Bridget was not beside her on the crowded stairs. She tried to wait, but the crowd of chattering operatives pushed her forward. She went down to the bottom of the stairs and stepped out of the stream. 100 or more girls went past. She was puzzled. Surely Bridget had been right beside her. They had been talking. Bridget had asked her what thraldom was. She was trying laboriously to read Mr. Douglas's book, but was yet to get through the first page of the preface. At last, the stairs were empty of clattering feet and the shrill laughter of young women at the end of a long workday. But still, there was no Bridget. Liddy hesitated. Perhaps the girl had gone ahead? Or perhaps she had forgotten something and gone back? Liddy started across the nearly deserted yard. Her supper would be waiting, and Mrs. Bedloe was insulted by tardiness. She had got nearly to the gate when something made her stop, nose up, like a doe with young in the thicket. She hurried back and climbed the 4 flights to the weaving room. The lamps had been extinguished by the operatives as they left their looms, so at first her eyes could make out nothing but the hulking shapes of the machines. Then she heard a strained, high-pitched voice. "Please, sir, please, Mr. Marsden." Liddy snatched up the fire bucket. It was full of water, but she didn't notice the weight. "Please, no." She ran down the aisle between the looms toward the voice and saw in the shadows Bridget, eyes white with fear, and Mr. Marsden's back. His hands were clamped on Bridget's arms. "Mr. Marsden!" At the sound of her hoarse cry, the overseer whirled about. She crammed the fire bucket down over his shiny pate, his bulging eyes, his rosebud mouth fixed in a perfect little O. The stagnant water sloshed over his shoulders and ran down his trousers. She let go of the bucket and grabbed Bridget's hand. They began to run, Liddy dragging Bridget across the floor. Behind, in the darkness, she thought she had heard the noise of an angry bear crashing an oatmeal pot against the furniture. She started to laugh. By the time they were at the bottom of the stairs, she was weak with laughter and her side ached, but she kept running, through the empty yard, past the startled gatekeeper, across the bridge, and down the row of wide-eyed boarding houses, dragging a bewildered Bridget behind her. Okay, so an interesting turn of events here. So now that we have read chapter 20, I'm going to go over the questions that you need to answer for chapter 20. There are going to be 10 of them. This is what they look like. I'm going to read them for you so that maybe you'll understand what the questions are asking a little bit better. And then you're going to need to go back into EDSB and you're going to need to complete these questions and submit them. Please don't just hit submit. You actually have to answer them or you will get a 0. Okay? So question number 1 says, what does the word scrupulous mean as it is used on page 155? And then I give you the quote with the sentence here. She feared then that he might find some reason to dismiss her, so she had been scrupulous to observe every regulation to the letter. So this he that they're talking about here is Mr. Marsden, and Liddy feared that Mr. Marsden might find a reason to dismiss her, so she had been scrupulous to observe every regulation. Well, think about what does the word regulation mean? Another word for that is a rule. So she's trying to observe every rule. She's being very scrupulous. So what word means the same as that? Okay. Question 2, what 2 books did Liddy buy herself in chapter 20? Oh, and I need to fix that. Look at that. I spelled that wrong. It should be B-U-Y. I will fix that before I put that up. So you need to just figure out what 2 books she bought herself in this chapter and choose the correct answer. Question 3, read this quote. A great yoke had been lifted from her shoulders, had it not? What does the word yoke mean as it is used here? Okay, so the great yoke being lifted from her shoulders was when she was talking about not having to worry about Rachel, not having to worry about Diana anymore. A great yoke had been lifted from her shoulders. So what are they talking about here? What is another word for yoke or phrase? Then what does Liddy say that why does Liddy say that a great yoke had been lifted from her shoulders? So you're going to need to get the question 3 right to understand question 4. Question 5, how was Bridget different than Liddy when it came to teaching the new girls at the corporation? So when Bridget is teaching the new girls, how does she approach it? Liddy was a little bit different when it came to teaching Bridget, but how does Bridget do it? So I need you to make these in a complete sentence. So you can start something by saying like, Bridget taught the girls, and then tell me how she taught them, okay? Why would Liddy tear up the letter from Charlie? So again, I want you to put these in complete sentences, so you can start with Liddy tore up, the letter from Charlie, not Harley, Charlie, because, and then you finish the rest of that, okay? Please make sure you're restating the question. You need to give a complete answer. Question 7, what did the letter in September have to say? So she got another letter in September. You just need to make sure you're selecting the correct answer. Question 8, what does Liddy mean when she says, quote, fire was a constant dread while the lamps burned? I gave you the page number here so you can go back to what they were talking about in the factory. She said that fire was a constant dread. What does that mean? Something being a constant dread. Okay, think about something that you dread, something that you're dreading, something that you don't want to do. And if it's constant, what does constant mean? It's always around, okay? What did Liddy, question number 9, what did Liddy do to Mr. Marsden in chapter 20? So we just read that on the last page. What did she do to him? And this is true or false. Mr. Marsden clamped down on Bridget's arms, holding her back. So did he do that? Yes or no, true or false? Okay, so that's going to be 10 questions that you need to answer. Chapter 20 comprehension questions is going to be the title of them. That's how you can find them on Edsby. And that'll be it for today. So make sure you did your Brightfish post test and that you're doing these chapter 20 questions, and that's it for this week. Okay, have a wonderful Wednesday.